Next up on our drawdown is transport. Sorry. We have already touched on transport in a few sections. Starting with this again, looking at global greenhouse gas emissions by sector. This is already a couple of years old, but nonetheless the data keeps coming in, and the main story is not going to change in terms of the contribution of the transport sector, which is in the range of 16-17% of the energy production. Of course, there is transport involved in various other sectors as well. If you take food production industry as a whole, for example, obviously there is transportation involved. Nonetheless, directly accounting for road transport, aviation, shipping, and rail, we have that number there. But you can also look at it this way. Global CO2 emissions from transport. This is based on global transport emissions in 2018, which totaled 8 billion tons of CO2. Transport accounts for 24% of the CO2 emissions from the energy, so that's already different than the number shown here, but as I said, it's hidden also into other sectors, which is accounted for here. So the road transport passengers, including cars, motorcycles, buses, and taxis, amount to 45.1%, and the freight transport, like trucks and lorries, account for 29.4%. Aviation is at 11.6% of passenger emissions, 60% from international and 40% from domestic. So shipping is 10.6%, rail is 1%, and others, so mainly transport of oil, gas, steam, and other materials via pipelines, is at 2.2%. Each one of these hide few things. For example, as India and China and other countries want to grow economically, and you cannot blame them for that, the number of vehicles owned by individuals keeps going up. So number of cars, motorcycles, etc. goes up. Unfortunately, that also often means reduced riderships on public transportations and use of Uber and Ola and other ride-hailing tax services go up as well. So this is seen as a double-edged sword, because you want to overall reduce transportation by people as much as possible, but in the meantime you also want to worry about how to make them more efficient, right? Honestly, transport is part of the travel, and human travel has always been very important part of cultural exchanges, awareness, learning, education, business, cultural exchanges, and so on and so forth. The problem that's adding to this also is that the transport and communication costs have dropped quite a bit compared to 1930. So here sea freight corresponds to average international freight charges from freight charges per ton. Passenger air transport corresponds to average airline revenue per passenger mile until 2000, spliced to US import air passenger fares afterwards. Some complicated assumptions. International calls correspond to, so we won't bother with communications right now. So you can see that sea freight cost relative to 1930 has dropped from 100% at 1930 to a reference of 20% now, so 80% drop. Passenger air transport cost relative to 1930 has dropped more than almost 90%, and international calling costs have basically dropped to zero compared to 1930. Even I remember when I was young, we had to book calls to make international call from the US where I was to reach home, and so on and so forth. So this obviously adds to increases in travel as well. So domestic travel in countries like India and China, for example, are growing exponentially and are continued to grow for some time, and we all love the convenience, of course. percentage of total passenger CO2 emissions here. So carbon intensity drops in terms of flight distance, and then it remains flat. So the biggest cost is in takeoff, and hence the shorter rides, domestic flights, tend to be more carbon intensive per passenger than long distance. So if you travel long distance, the total emission, of course, is higher for the whole aircraft, but percentage of total passenger CO2 emissions or carbon intensity, revenue per passenger, revenue per kilometer drops. So that's some airline jargon there. Nonetheless, this is not as simple as one would imagine. So this is again from IEA, which shows the projections out to 2070 in terms of aviation, shipping, medium and heavy trucks, buses, minibuses, and rail, etc. So global CO2 emissions in transport by mode in the sustainable development scenario is expected to drop. So in terms of gigaton CO2 per year, so by 2040, two to three-wheelers are here, rail is here by 2050, and so on, and passenger cars, buses, and minibuses are down here. Again, the message is you want to reduce the number of cars and buses, and this becomes obvious when we look at the public transit, mass transit. So ranking of mass transit by 2050 is at number 37, with potential reduced CO2 at 6.57 gigatons according to this model calculation. The data is too variable, and net savings can still be estimated. The net cost is too variable to be determined, but net savings can still be estimated at $2.8 trillion, and there are massive co-benefits in terms of air quality, human health, children's health especially, and so on. Traffic jams, reduced traffic jams are one of the biggest co-benefits of reducing individual passenger vehicles. So this is showing here Saturday evening, city suffers 95% congestion. Talking about Mumbai, which is among the worst congested cities in the world. In fact, in this list it tops the world at 65%, and Bogota, Colombia, which has one of the best public transits, is still having traffic jams. New Delhi is also in here, which is pretty bad, and so on. So you can see the world map here: Beijing, Cape Town, Tokyo, London, Vancouver, and New York, right? So what does it mean? All these travel distances are listed, and traffic woes are listed. So reducing traffic jam, improving air quality, releasing the space of all those parking spots leaves more space for other things in cities like public parks, for example. And there are some amazing examples. This is a story of James Lerner, who was the mayor of Curitiba, which is in Brazil, which is the capital of the state of Paraná. And he, in the 1970s, and then he became mayor several times through to the 1990s, I think 3 times, decided that he was going to change the mass transit story. So he started making improvements like buying just simple things like buying tickets at the train bus station before boarding to save time, to make these kind of tubes where people board and deboard the plane, the bus, and there are multiple entrances to the buses to increase the volume flow and reduce the time it takes. And now there are additional facilities being added. You can see the tube structure of the bus boarding and deboarding, which really facilitates things in terms of the speed up of the passenger getting on and getting off, and reducing travel times to stay on time, and making separate bus lanes, as well as now there are many places which offer the same card, metro card for example, which can be used for buses, for trains, for riding bicycles, and so on. So these kind of simple things end up improving the systems quite a bit. So that's James Lerner. I don't know how exactly it's pronounced, but you can look it up. Born in 1937, is a Brazilian politician, still around. He was the governor of the state of Paraná in southern Brazil. He is renowned as an architect and urban planner, having been mayor of Curitiba, capital of Paraná, 3 times, 71, 75, 79, 84, 89, 92. In 94, Lerner was elected governor of Paraná and was re-elected in 1998. So his ideas were also copied into other Latin American countries like Colombia and so on. So use of mass transit is projected to decline, unfortunately, from 37% of urban travel to 21% as the low-income world gains wealth. So as countries like India grow and middle class grows, in per capita GDP grows, people prefer to buy individual vehicles, two, three-wheel vehicles or cars. If use grows instead to 40% of urban travel by 2050, this solution can save 6.6 gigatons of carbon dioxide emissions from cars. Our analysis includes diverse mass transit options, bus, metro, tram, commuter rail, and examines the costs that travelers pay car purchase use compared to buying transit tickets and so on. And there are those co-benefits we talked about: walkable cities, bikeable cities, reduced traffic congestion in the cities, increased park areas, improved air quality, and so on and so forth. Okay, so incredibly good, no regret solution that hopefully will just grow, and especially now with the US, the Biden administration is putting lots of planning to put a lot of money into bringing back bus and trains as major modes of transportation. So a country like US, if it moves away from individual vehicle miles to public mass transit, then it'll be really a good example for rest of the world as well.